Lord Alfred Hayes, the Queen's emissary to the madhouse known as the World Wrestling Federation. A man so British, he probably wiped his feet before walking into a locker room. He showed up to WWF with the posture of a royal corgi and the voice of a man narrating tea commercials, and then proceeded to spend the next decade secretly hating half the roster. Not because they were villains, but because they were uncouth buffoons who made him question the future of the industry. Now, here's the real kicker. While Hayes looked and sounded like dignity in a tuxedo, behind the curtain he had more twisted rib stories than a barbecue joint. Ask Roddy Piper, who once wrote that Hayes approached him butt naked, swinging his junk like a hypnotist's watch and calling out, "Hot Rod," like it was foreplay. It was like watching Roy Rogers trying to lasso Dale Evans. Roddy Piper in the pit with Piper. Hayes laughed. Piper did not. In fact, young Roddy, who was just 15 when he got into the business, said the incident left him rattled enough to confront Vince McMahon about the WWF's backstage culture. And this wasn't an isolated story. Multiple sources say Hayes had a go-to prank where he'd ask rookies to close their eyes and hold out their hands, only to drop his family jewels into their palms like it was a Christmas surprise from Buckingham Palace. So yes, Lord Alfred may have loathed the cartoonish disasters prancing around him on screen, but off-screen he wasn't exactly the patron saint of professionalism. He hated stupidity. He hated sloppiness. And apparently he hazed like a fraternity reject with a Downton Abbey accent. This video isn't here to make excuses for Lord Alfred Hayes, but it is here to roast the 5 wrestlers he couldn't stand in the WWF, the ones who made him grit his teeth, tighten his cravat, and wish he was back in England teaching bad actors how to fall down gracefully. Make some noise for the Mountie, Jacqu Roujo, everybody. The only man to ever cosplay as a Canadian cop and somehow still look less intimidating than a mall security guard on Xanax. This guy walked around yelling, "I am the Mountie." Like that meant something. Dude, you're not a Mountie. You're a stripper who got lost on the way to a bachelorette party. I've seen tougher people in Sesame Street. If Canada ever needed to surrender to someone, they'd send this guy to the front lines just to confuse the enemy into a ceasefire. Jacqu Roujo had all the intensity of a guy asking if you've heard the good news about French-Canadian traffic laws. He carried a cattle prod like it was supposed to make him scary. Bro, it's not intimidating if you shock people after you've already pinned them. That's not wrestling, that's electrocuting the unconscious. Even Jeffrey Dahmer's watching like, yo, chill. And backstage, this guy had more heat than a hot yoga studio in July. Got punched out by Dynamite Kid and cried to his dad. The only time this guy won a fight was in catering when someone dropped a baguette. He wasn't a locker room leader. He was a locker room lesson, as in, don't be like that guy. Lord Alfred Hayes watched the Mountie and probably thought, this is why Canada should have stayed part of the Empire. The Mountie wasn't a heel, he was a hallucination. If stupidity wore a uniform, it'd look just like him. Red, shiny, and absolutely full of crap. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Brutus, the Barber Beefcake, the only man in wrestling history to turn a pair of scissors into a career. And I mean that literally. If it weren't for Hulk Hogan, this guy would have been cutting coupons, not hair. Brutus Beefcake looked like if Fabio fell down a flight of steroids. This man was so plastic, I thought Hasbro made him. His ring gear screamed, "I'm here to wrestle," or host an underground Chippendales show in a Florida swamp. And that mullet? Jesus. You know your haircut's a war crime when even Lord Alfred Hayes, a man who wore velvet in the summer, looked at you and said, "How uncivilized." Let's talk about the gimmick. A barber? Really? That's not a wrestling character. That's a plan B after you fail out of beauty school. Brutus would win a match, then give his opponent an unsolicited haircut like a cracked-out Edward Scissorhands. Imagine losing to a guy who looks like he got dressed in a strip club blackout, then waking up with a fade worse than his promo skills. Backstage, the only thing Beefcake was known for was being Hogan's human fanny pack. You couldn't find him on a card without checking Hogan's waistband. Lord Alfred Hayes, a man who believed in skill and legacy, probably looked at Brutus and thought, "What's this tosser doing in the ring, other than making it dumber by standing there?" Brutus wasn't over. He was carried. By Hogan, by gimmicks, by luck. The only thing he ever cut was the credibility of the midcard. To paraphrase Lord Alfred Hayes, he couldn't wrestle his way out of a salon. Make some noise for Bad News Brown, and the only wrestler whose gimmick was being visibly pissed off that he has to be here. This guy looked like he punched mirrors before brushing his teeth. Lord Alfred Hayes couldn't stand Bad News Brown, not because he was tough, but because the guy walked around like he just got cut off in traffic for 15 straight years. Hayes was all about class, poise, storytelling. Bad news? His whole ring psychology was, what if a mosh pit had hands? And let's be clear, this wasn't just in-character heat. Bad news hated everybody. He called out Hogan for being fake, Andre for farting in his face on a bus, and the WWF for being too white, which, let's be real, he wasn't wrong about. But Hayes? Alfred was the embodiment of British restraint, and Bad News wrestled like he was trying to end polite society. Backstage, Bad News Brown acted like every conversation was a threat. The dude had more beef than a Texas barbecue. Hayes once referred to him as uncultured, which is British for, I wouldn't invite this man to a funeral, let alone a match. Bad News was the kind of guy who'd slap your tea out of your hand just because it was chamomile. His finisher? The Ghetto Blaster, a name that aged like milk in a sauna. Alfred probably heard that and said, good heavens, is this a wrestling match or the soundtrack to a mugging? The guy was so grumpy, even Lord Alfred, a man who wore cravats and gave heel commentary with manners, wanted to hit him with a thesaurus and tell him to calm the hell down. Bad News wasn't a bad guy, he was just bad company, and Alfred had no time for a man who wrestled like a felony in progress. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Nails. The only wrestler who sounded like he swallowed a cheese grater and screamed through a sock full of battery acid. This guy didn't cut promos, he left voicemails for Satan. Let's talk about the gimmick. Vince handed us an actual criminal in a bright orange jumpsuit and said, trust me, he's going to be huge. And sure, he was, in mugshots. Nails looked like the guy at the bar who tells you he's not that kind of felon. He didn't wrestle, he lunged. He moved like he was trying to shank the canvas for snitching. Lord Alfred Hayes saw him and said, good heavens, someone call the authorities. No, the real ones. This man got into the business to play a convict and left the business because he acted like one. He actually assaulted Vince McMahon, choked him out. You know how bad you have to be at faking violence to end up committing the real thing? Nails didn't just burn bridges. He pissed on them, poured gasoline, and threatened to sue the ashes. His run was so short, the only thing lower than his win-loss record was his SAT score. And let's not forget, his whole I hate the big boss man feud was built around prison abuse. That's right. Nails got on national television and yelled, he touched me! In a voice so distorted it made Kylo Ren sound like Liberace. To Lord Alfred Hayes, this wasn't wrestling. This was witness protection with pyros. He wasn't a monster heel. He was a walking court summons. Nails wasn't cut from the cloth. He was yanked out of the evidence locker. Give it up for Iron Mike Sharp. Canada's answer to the question, what if a broken foghorn had anxiety? This man didn't wrestle matches. He screamed through them. Every time he took a headlock, it sounded like he was being murdered in Morse code. If whining was an Olympic sport, Iron Mike would have had more gold than Kurt Angle. Lord Alfred Hayes called his matches like he was narrating a mental breakdown. You could hear the aristocratic pain in his voice every time Mike grunted like a hog caught in an electric fence. Hayes once said on commentary, he's a bit vocal, isn't he? Which is British for, this man sounds like a dying goat getting a prostate exam. But wait, it wasn't just the noise. This man had heat backstage. Why? Because he refused to shower. Legitimately. For weeks. Guys were spraying deodorant like they were decontaminating a chemical spill. You didn't work a match with Iron Mike Sharp. You survived him. He wore that black forearm brace for like 15 years. Nobody ever checked it. Nobody cared. At some point, it started to smell like his career. Dead, padded, and full of excuses. He was the loudest loser in the whole of the WWF. He was the first guy who could oversell a lockup and still underdeliver a promo. Watching Sharp wrestle was like watching your drunk uncle try to get off the couch without farting. To Lord Alfred Hayes, Iron Mike wasn't a worker. He was a punishment, a cautionary tale in boots. They say jobbers don't get remembered. Mike Sharp did, but only because his stench lingered longer than his legacy. Imagine walking into the World Wrestling Federation with the poise of a royal butler and realizing you're surrounded by cartoon convicts, shrieking jobbers, pig cops, and men who use hedge clippers like diplomas. That was Lord Alfred Hayes' daily life in the WWF. A cultured, sharp-witted technician. Alfred Hayes had grace. These guys had gimmicks. Alfred had wit. They had foam props. He didn't just call matches. He narrated chaos like David Attenborough watching a zoo riot. But what made Alfred legendary wasn't his disdain. It was his restraint. In a world full of sideshows, Lord Alfred Hayes was the last ringmaster, and everybody else? They were just the animals throwing their own shit. God saved the Queen, and God helped the locker room that had to follow Lord Alfred's eye roll. Like, Comment, share, subscribe. If this roast left a mark, do the right thing. Slap that like button, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who deserves the burn. More heat coming soon. Thanks for watching.